Hello, my name is Sarah Zedek. My pronouns are she, her. I'm wearing a mask because I haven't shaved in 2 days, and you are not entitled to me looking my best. So there's been some controversy going around about sex scenes in movies and whether or not they add anything. There's at least one op-ed making the rounds right now on Substack that insists that the Hays Code, the self-imposed industry-wide censorship regime for Hollywood in the starting in the late 30s into the 40s and 50s, was good for movies because it forced filmmakers to get creative in the works that they made. This is often an argument you hear about various censorship regimes that, the censorship was bad, but a lot of the art that was made under those restrictions was really good because really inventive artists were able to get around that censorship in really creative and interesting ways. And that's true. That's an argument that I have made on a number of occasions over the course of my life. I feel like it is a relatively uncontroversial thing to say that art thrives with limitations. I think that artists are at their best when they have to work within some constraints rather than have the infinite field of possibility in front of them. But I think people fall for this argument a little bit too quickly and too wholeheartedly at times. I am not going to go off at length about the Hays Code. I think chances are everybody's on the same page as me that it was bad all around, and that any argument that censorship, government mandated or not, is good and good for art especially, they're just a fascist. They're just a fascist. It's just fascism. It's not a perspective that deserves to be taken seriously whatsoever. There are a number of videos and articles and things that have come out recently talking about, are sex scenes good? Should nudity be in media? Do sex scenes add anything? It's very funny to me that you see that argument like, oh, well, sex scenes are just uncomfortable and they don't add anything to movies. And then they watch Marvel movies. I would say most action scenes in most movies are actually more detrimental than any sex scene has ever been. But whatever, none of that really matters. What I want to say instead has to do with censorship's relationship to creativity in general. I think we've all had our moments in our lives when we have found filmmakers, especially queer filmmakers, who manage to make sort of transgressive and sexually expressive art under censorship regimes like the Hays Code. My problem with this argument is that even though it implicitly acknowledges that censorship is sort of bad, it still gives a fair amount of cover to studios and to the era as sort of saying like, well, the censorship was bad, but all of these movies got made. Look at all these great movies that got made. Every movie that I've ever seen from the 40s is so good and interesting and has all this queer subtext, as if that's not sort of self-selection or historical selection or historical curation. The problem with discussing censorship in terms of the good art that managed to succeed in spite of censorship is that it acts like those success stories are all of the stories, as if every filmmaker sort of came up against censorship and took it as a challenge, as sort of a fun little puzzle to solve, when the reality is that the handful of filmmakers and films that managed to succeed in spite of the Hays Code are a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the films that we could have gotten had there never been a Hays Code. We talk about censorship in media, particularly, especially in America, in terms of what gets made in spite of it. But the thing about censorship is that it is never about the 1 in a million success story. It should never be talked about primarily through the stuff that managed to succeed in spite of it. The problem of censorship is every single thing that never got made. Like, yeah, sure. Yeah, there's some great movies that came out of the Hays Code era. There would have been a hell of a lot more had there never been a Hays Code. I think it can be easy from this particular moment when pretty much all contemporary, like majorly successful cinema is about big actiony, adulty things filtered through a child's toyified lens, to look back on the Hays Code era and be like, well, yeah, but the dialogue is good and the performances are good, and just sort of pretend like the production conditions were the same, 70 years ago that they are today, that there are no other factors at play in this very complicated historical materialist equation. And I think it's easy to look back from this moment at the 70s, at the era when you started to see the American New Wave, sort of following on the heels of the French New Wave, with directors like Scorsese and Spielberg and Kafka. No, not what's his name? Francis Ford Coppola. Francis Ford Kafka. All of them filmmakers who were sort of the first generation to go to film school, where they studied film and made film. And they were lucky enough to come out of college at a moment when the Paramount decision threw the entire studio system for a loop and just completely upended the economic models that had dominated the Hollywood film system for their entire lifetimes up to that point. And that included the Hays Code. A lot of those films produced in that era were violent and sexual and kind of fucked up. You watch Taxi Driver now, that's a pretty fucked up movie, actually. I think it's easy to look at that moment from this perspective and say, this is where the problem started. This is where our fixation on gruesome on-screen violence and glorifying toxic masculinity comes from. But the difference is that those were films made by independent directors and writers and producers who were doing something that they wanted to do on their own terms, more or less. The actual story is always more complicated. I'm generalizing. I haven't been to film school in some years, so my history is a little rusty. But in a general sense, these films were the result of people who grew up consuming the media that was produced from this censorship era, and they came out of that wanting to do things that they had never seen before, that had their entire lives at that point been deemed impossible for American cinema. Like a lot of things in America right now, it didn't start to get really, really, really bad until the 80s, when you saw the blockbuster sort of take over Hollywood. And alongside that, you had the loosening of antitrust pressures on the film industry to the point where today, now, Disney, it's arguable whether or not they are a textbook vertically integrated monopoly, but in all form and function, they are a super monopoly of insurmountable size and proportion and reach. The actual cause of this moment, in my opinion, comes down to another generation of people who grew up similarly to the American New Wave, but they grew up with the American New Wave as their sort of standard. These people saw the sort of acclaim of the auteur. That's the era of the rise of the auteur and the sort of prestige of the great filmmakers of that era. And they wanted to have their names and lights at the same level as Scorsese and all the rest. But they just had one problem. They didn't have any skills or talent whatsoever, and they didn't know why art existed or why people would like art. I am talking about rich people. I'm talking about the CEO class, the ruling class, the bourgeoisie of Hollywood, if you will. What we have right now is a generation of executive auteurs, a group of rich, talentless fucks who have decided that they want to control every single aspect of film production down to the very wire of its release, which is why now digital production has taken over so much of Hollywood, and why it seems more and more that, especially in the Marvel movie space and the Disney space, the director, the writer, the actors, they're all kind of just perfunctory. They're all just names that show up on the poster, and then you watch the movie and you're like, well, I guess Sam Raimi directed that. The problem is not that sex scenes add nothing to movies. The problem is that conservative rich people control what media gets made, even though there is no explicit censorship regime in place at this moment in history. And these conservative millionaires and billionaires don't like it when actual sex happens. So they prefer the sex to be sort of like, well, yeah, you can show people having sex, but you can't actually, like, you can't show a tit. One of my biggest pet peeves in movies and TV shows right now, especially on HBO, and like any streaming service where they're like, ooh, we're doing R-rated stuff. It's like, check it out. We've got full frontal nudity. Look at this thin white woman and her big perky breasts. So you're going to show some dick, or are we going to see some dongs going in? Are we going to do a Lars von Trier thing? Oh, no, okay, so our sort of R-rated saucy revolution, the kind of like, oh, this isn't your granddad's movies, this is streaming. And now in this amazing era of progressive queer positivity and unlimited creativity for access to creativity for marginalized people, we now have the ability to produce a movie where somebody kind of bleeds kids, and they can grab a boob and they can say a fuck. They can say so many fucks, dude. You can say so many fucks in TV now, and a whole lot of writers think that counts as being funny. Haha, oops, looks like I forgot to empty out the card on my camera, and at some point in the middle of me ranting, it just stopped. So I don't know what the footage is on this video from here on out, but that's my bad. Haha, wee! The problem with this moment in film history is not that we need a return to censorship. The problem is that we need a return to actual filmmakers being able to make movies. When was the last time you heard about an indie director who did like a weird sci-fi epic? You remember Darren Aronofsky's The Fountain? I saw that movie in theaters. That was, what, 2005? Say what you will about Darren Aronofsky, and there's a lot that you could say about that man. That movie is pretty awesome. I love that movie. This is a completely separate tangent, but a lot of people love to cite that movie as like, oh, it was, especially in the day when it came out, it's so confusing, it's so difficult to follow. No, it's not. No, it's not. It's actually it's a very simple, straightforward movie. You just have to accept the possibility that metaphors are real, which is a big ask for an American film-going audience. I get that. We are addicted to literalism and absolutely all of our media, which is why ending explained videos exist. That's actually every single ending explained video is metaphors. Have you ever heard of a metaphor? Yep. That's it. That's the ending. That's the end. It's a metaphor. Oh wait, I didn't finish what I was saying about Darren Aronofsky. I can't remember off the top of my head what that movie's budget was or anything like that, but I know it was a relatively low budget movie that used a lot of really inventive optical effects to create its special effects shots. A lot of the space travel shots were practical. It was just like fluids underwater filmed in slow motion. You know, right now I'll complain about like, oh, there's too many Marvel movies in cinemas. There's too many of these big budget corporate slop movies. And people say, well, there are still independent movies. You still got A24. And that's true. Stuff still does get made. But I feel like our definition of an indie movie has sort of collapsed. Independent filmmakers used to make like low budget sci-fi stuff. And now it feels like we have infinite After Effects. We have more ability for any given filmmaker to make a decent looking sci-fi movie, and yet those movies just don't seem to exist, or if they do, they are not distributed and they are not seen by human people anymore anywhere. Instead, what you get is straight to streaming garbage that was filmed in a weekend and just doesn't look good and doesn't sound good and is very clearly just not really a passion project from anybody. Something that was produced under extreme duress economically and probably chronologically that may have had people, most likely had quite a lot of people on the film who were deeply invested in making the best thing that they could, but simply did not have the money and time to do so. But with our addiction to sort of everything being literal in media, it feels like if you were to make a sci-fi movie that used sort of like rubber suits with zippers and old school Star Trek style kind of like painted styrofoam or plywood walls or whatever, with just little lights and stuff everywhere. It didn't try to be like absolutely realistic. People would be like, oh, that looks cheap. That looks like shit or whatever. And I don't know. It all kind of comes around on this idea that we have a fetish for absolute utility in cinema. A lot of the sex scene, nudity, action, violence, crap, all those arguments always come down to this sort of thing of like, is it necessary? Is it necessary? Do we need sex scenes in movies? Do we need nudity in movies? Do we really need blood and gore and violence in movies? The answer is no, because we don't need anything in movies, because movies don't occur naturally in nature. They're a thing that we make, that we choose to make. Every single time people choose to make movies. They don't need anything. They just are. The question is why and how and who. As far as I'm concerned, any conversation like this, the place that it needs to be driven back to at all times is censorship is bad. We need to get rid of monopolies and make it so that real human beings who were not grown in a pod in like Palo Alto can make art. We can argue until the cows come home about whether or not one thing should or should not be allowed to be depicted. But at the end of the day, things will be depicted one way or another. And all of this kind of just presumes a level of influence from media that is just really rather unhinged. This is a weird aside. Did you know that human beings have been having sex like forever? And that it's really not a scary or weird or strange or disgusting or abnormal kind of thing. It's not an artist's responsibility to cater their art to like one suburban mom in Wisconsin who thinks that the devil is speaking to her child. Long story short, censorship is bad. If you want to see better movies, better art, more creative art, then you should be advocating for like a 99% tax on the Disney Corporation and a massive redistribution of wealth to the working class, massive welfare programs, guaranteed housing and health care, and public transportation so that people do not have to waste 80 to 90% of their lives just struggling to make ends meet, leaving only rich people and their awful fail sons to produce all of culture. We don't need more censorship. We need to give poor people more money. All right, that's the video. Thank you for watching. Patreon.com/LTAS, camaraderie.co/SarahZedig, Twitter @HMSNoFun, Mastodon, SarahZedig @Shrike.club.